There is a fifth dimension beyond that which is known to man. It is a dimension as vast as space and as timeless as infinity. It is the middle ground between light and shadow, between science and superstition, and it lies between the pit of man's fears and the summit of his knowledge. This is a dimension of imagination. It is an area which we call the Twilight Zone.
Welcome to the Serious TV Drama Podcast, Twilight Zone Edition. I'm your host, Scott Eric Handiotti, and joining me this evening for another venture into the unknown, we once again welcome back Brian Hewlett. Always good to see you and hear you, Brian.
It's good to be back with you, Scott. I enjoyed these episodes and think there's a thread between them we'll be able to tie together and hopefully bring some enjoyment to the listeners doing it.
Ooh, I'm now looking more forward to it than I thought I would be. Well, tonight's podcast, we will be examining two more notable Twilight Zone episodes, People Are Alike All Over and Execution, which are the 25th and 26th episodes from the first season of The Twilight Zone that originally aired back on March 25th and April 1st of 1960. Wow, 65 years ago. So let's get started by taking a closer look at People Are Alike All Over. Now, this episode was directed by Mitchell Leeson, whom we've discussed on two podcasts earlier this season, as he was the director of both The 16mm Shrine and Escape Clause, two very differently toned and themed episodes, and both quite different from this one as well. Now, for more on the man's backstory, I would recommend checking out our STVD episode 425, which covered two episodes, including The 16mm Shrine. And while I'm not partial to that Twilight Zone episode, I am a fan of that podcast episode. So let me move on to the writing of this episode. Rod Serling wrote the script for this one, but it was based on the short story Brothers Beyond the Void by sci-fi writer and mystery story dabbler Paul W. Fairman, a fairly prominent writer and editor for multiple anthology magazines such as Amazing Stories, Ellery Queen's Mystery Magazine, and others, as well as having some of his short stories either directly adapted for, or at least the inspiration for, several TV episodes and films as well. As to the actual story here, it originally appeared in an issue of Fantastic Adventures back in 1952. It was later appeared in a compendium of tales titled Worlds of Tomorrow. I was able to track down a transcript of the entire story, and I will be discussing that later. As for now, let's get to the cast of People Are Alike All Over. And in the lead role of Sam Conrad, we have Mr. Roddy McDowall. Certainly one of the most recognizable actors so far this season, and possibly for the series overall. Roddy McDowall may be best known for the role that didn't feature his face at all, Cornelius in Planet of the Apes, which of course has a Rod Serling connection as Serling wrote the adapted screenplay for that film. McDowall would also appear in three more Planet of the Apes films, as well as a TV series, first as Cornelius and later as Caesar, his predecessor. Now, as far as his life story is concerned, he was born in London back in 1928. He was first a child actor in the late 30s and 40s. He appeared in films such as How Green Was My Valley and, of course, Lassie Come Home. The 50s, that was more about leaving Hollywood whenever possible and being a stage actor in New York, as well as racking up a number of TV appearances in pretty much every original anthology-structured series of that era. Everything from Playhouse 90 all the way to, well, The Twilight Zone. Now, his profile raised considerably more in the 60s, from hits on Broadway such as the original Camelot to performances in films either popular or even notorious, which means movies like The Longest Day or even Cleopatra. He continued to do a lot of high-profile TV work as well, and this was the case all the way through the 70s, where, among other things, he, of course, appeared, I'm going to mention this, as one of the more memorable murderers on an episode of Columbo. His career would continue to fluctuate between TV and film, well, mostly TV, but he would occasionally appear in a feature film, such as the Agatha Christie adaptation of Evil Under the Sun, and of course the much-appreciated comedy horror film Fright Night, and I believe its sequel as well. He also, of course, had a very distinctive voice, and he could be heard in any number of animated features and TV shows, everything from Wind in the Willows to playing the Mad Hatter on the Batman animated series of the 1990s. And beyond acting, he was also an acclaimed photographer. His work appeared for years in publications such as Look, Vogue, and Life. There were 5 books published covering a number of his photos. Now, I haven't delved too much into his private life here, as he wasn't necessarily overtly open about his sexuality, but it is fairly well known that he was in a relationship with Montgomery Clift back in the 1950s. Allegedly, he had even attempted suicide after they broke up, but nevertheless, he remained friends with Clift until his passing. Montgomery's passing, I mean. He was always busy with work, as well as a number of charities and prestigious panels, such as the Screen Actors Guild, the National Film Preservation Board, and so on. He was a working guy, literally right up to his unfortunate death in 1998 from cancer. Next, we have Susan Oliver as the perpetually sad Martian Tina. Susan Oliver was born Charlotte Gerke in 1932. Her father was a journalist for the New York World and her mother an astrologist. They divorced when she was still a child, but coming from money, she went to various boarding schools as well as traveled the world with her dad, even attending college in Japan. She continued her collegiate studies back in the States, briefly spent time with her mother, who had now become an astrologer to the stars of Hollywood, and she eventually became a trained and appreciated stage actress. She mainly graduated from the stage directly to television. Even with the occasional film credit like the Gene Krupa story in 1958, Susan Oliver had a long career stretching from the mid-50s all the way to the late 80s, because she did pass away in 1990. But she appeared on a number of TV series throughout the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And I do know her in her later years, she started appearing on every single CBS detective show of that era. Murder, She Wrote, Magnum PI, Simon & Simon, you name it. But she's actually probably best known for appearing in the original pilot for Star Trek, The Cage, which was refashioned for, the Menagerie Parts 1 and 2 later on. One might even note a few similarities between that Star Trek episode and this Twilight Zone episode, namely a clearly advanced race capturing humans and studying them and so on. And she's kind of sad there, too. Oh, there is at least one more Serling connection with Miss Oliver. She does appear in an episode of Night Gallery, but it was in a segment that was not written by Rod Serling. Now, next, let's take a look at the man who played perhaps the worst fated Earthman in the story, Markison, and that actor was Paul Comey. Born in Brookline, Massachusetts in 1932, Comey, a recipient of not less than 3 Purple Hearts after his time serving in the Korean War. He was mainly a TV actor from the 1950s through the 90s before eventually retiring and passing away in 2016. Not to say that he didn't have the occasional film role to his credit. He certainly had smaller parts in films as varied as the original Cape Fear, The Young Lions, The Towering Inferno, and even Howard the Duck. Like McDowell, he does actually appear in a Planet of the Apes film. He's a cop in Conquest of Planet of the Apes. And like Oliver, he's also in a fairly noteworthy episode of Star Trek. He's in Balance of Terror. But to finally bring it back to the Twilight Zone, he does appear in 2 more Twilight Zone episodes. Season 2's The Odyssey of Flight 33. It's a very good episode if I recall. And Season 4's The Parallel. When it comes to the other cast members, namely the male Martians, I suppose it is fun to note something about one of them, the shorter one that was portrayed by Vic Perrin. Perrin did an incredible amount of voiceover and animated voice work over the next few decades, be it superheroes ranging from Thor to Silver Surfer to Hawkman in various Marvel and DC series, to every Scooby-Doo series and everything else under the sun. But to remain sci-fi geeky here, he's the voice that we hear in, you may have guessed this was coming, in several classic Star Trek episodes. He's the Keeper in Part 2 of The Menagerie. He's Metron in Arena. I think that's the one with the Gorn. He's Nomad in The Changeling. And he does appear on screen, finally, in one more Trek episode. He's the character Tharn. You probably don't remember that name, but you'll remember the episode, then you'll remember who he is, because that's Mirror Mirror. So here we go. We've got all these great Trek connections. Oh, and he also does have one more Twilight Zone episode to his credit, Season 5's Ring-a-Ding Girl. All that said, let's get past the credits and on with the content of People Are Alike All Over. And as always, we start with Mr. Serling's opening narration. You're looking at a species of flimsy little 2-legged animals with extremely small heads. whose name is Man. Warren Markison, age 35. Samuel A. Conrad, age 31. They're taking a highway into space. Man unshackling himself and sending his tiny, groping fingers up into the unknown. Their destination is Mars, and in just a moment, we'll land there with them. And as said, these two astronauts are taking a trip to Mars. We soon learn that Conrad is the more apprehensive, the more cynically inclined of the two. Markison has a more laissez-faire attitude and philosophy, that regardless of the millions of miles that separate possible races on any planet, that people are alike everywhere. The rocket crash lands on Mars, and Markison is critically injured. At one point, knowing his end is near, Markison pleads with the panicky Conrad to open the hatch door so Markison can at least see the terrain in the world he gave his life to travel to. But Conrad still resists. Even as Markison dies, he's increasingly disturbed by a rhythmic banging on the ship's hull. Conrad eventually opens the door and is surprised to find a crowd of Martians outside, peering in. And they are indeed human in appearance. In fact, they seem downright friendly. He initially thinks they speak English, but they assure him he's actually under a specific state of hypnosis, and he is in fact speaking their language. Both amazed and bewildered, the Martians encourage Conrad to get some rest, and later give him a bigger surprise by gifting him with a home that looks like it was straight out of American suburbia, or actually perhaps a previous Twilight Zone episode. But before and after he enters, being shown all the home's amenities and rooms, it's obvious that the female Martian, Tina, is reluctant, even sad. The Martians eventually depart, even as they assure him he will see Tina again. Conrad strolls around his new home, lighting a cigarette, fixing himself a drink. He is really quite pleased with his surroundings, until he notices some doors don't open. And then that there are actually no windows in this house, even behind the drapes that he pulls down. And then the walls slide open, and we see he's on display, like an exhibit in a museum, or perhaps more precisely, an animal in a zoo. He fearfully cringes from the expectant eyes of all the onlookers, all except Tina, who wears the same sad and despondent expression as before. And when he reaches through the bars that now surround his house and picks up the sign in front of what is essentially less a home than a cage, the sign reads, "Earth creature in his native habitat." That's when Tina runs off, and he grabs the bars and looks skyward, proclaiming, Markison, you were right, you were right. People are alike everywhere." And then we close the episode with Serling's narration once again. Species of animal brought back alive. Interesting similarity in physical characteristics to human beings in head, trunk, arms, legs, hands, feet. Very tiny, undeveloped brain. Comes from primitive planet named Earth. Calls himself Samuel Conrad, and he will remain here in his cage with the running water and the electricity and the central heat as long as he lives. Samuel Conrad has found the Twilight Zone. So, first, let me say that, at least for me, I believe this to be one of the more, if anything, one of the more memorable lead performances of the first season. I think while McDowell does have a certain star quality that does pop off the screen, it's also a performance that covers a really wide range of emotions that, especially when you have that all contained within a 22-minute format. And it never seems rushed or as if he's hamming it up. And McDowell, especially in his later years, could ham it up with the best of them, but I don't think he does that so much in this episode. So, I mean, that was the first thing that struck me, just rewatching it. And also the fact that the overall story, it was the kind of thing I would have expected more from Richard Matheson or even Charles Beaumont. But instead, it does showcase how I don't think there's anyone who does as skilled a job at both adapting and in many ways reinventing a short story and refashioning it into a really well-regarded Twilight Zone episode the way Rod Serling would.
Yeah, I think this was a highlight for me because of Roddy McDowell's performance. And it's funny you say that because we haven't talked before this anything about it, but my notes were that his performance was a highlight of me watching it because I thought throughout the course of the episode, he conveyed like vulnerability, comfort, curiosity. His character had an arc that moved through different shades of emotion. Um, and just some of the other things I thought this story was really nice and economical in the way that the whole travel to Mars is skipped over, that you see sort of the prologue set up the mindset of the characters, then the trip, and then we just arrive. Another highlight for me that was kind of jarring was I thought the crash ship was a really nice set piece. That the way we start out with McDowell, basically trapped in his seat, hanging, has to release himself, find Marcuson. Um, and another interesting thing, and it to me, was that the entire portion of the Mars part of this episode, the pilot, he's hurt, but they establish eventually like he's dying the entire time he's talking, to his partner. And I thought there were really interesting ideas. A couple of questions I had watching it that it made me think. I thought if these people can read your mind and translate language to you, it's kind of curious because he didn't give off a sense of being a threatening person. That he was a scientist who, wanted answers and wanted to answer questions. It makes you wonder if that society um, is any more advanced than us with the ability to read minds, or if it really is the same, that despite them having greater abilities, they still cage things they don't understand, even if those things aren't a threat to them, which in many ways, someone who doesn't have their capabilities is a lower functioning creature than in the way that we treat the world with the creatures around us. So I thought that was very fascinating.
Well, you're essentially hitting what the theme and overall statement of the episode is, and as it's professed within the episode and in the title itself, people are alike all over. That's the realization at the end, because this is no different than the way we treat lower animals in things like zoos and whatever. I mean, I'm certain if we actually could read the minds of, be it, a lion or a gorilla or whatever, and they had, they are obviously sentient life forms, but, we might see that maybe they wouldn't necessarily mean us any harm if we weren't antagonistic to them in the first place. I was going to get into it more later, but I can get into it now because it's going to have to come up during the course of the conversation about this episode. This is one of the Twilight Zone episodes that definitely falls under the category of, you have a protagonist that's punished that might fall into the undeservedly so, which will happen, and there's nothing wrong with that. Those are usually, and those are usually the ones that really leave a mark on you when you think about them. Because an episode like the one that's going to come after this, when a character gets what's essentially their comeuppance, like the character in Escape Clause, for example, we establish he's not a good person. And he actually does some horrible things. He's basically almost sociopathic. But an episode like this, or even Bemis in, Time Enough at Last, quite frankly, doesn't really deserve the fate that he gets. He's not really that bad a person. There's nothing wrong with the Samuel Conrad character here. I mean, all this does is prove him right for being worried and not even wanting to go on the trip in the first place because he was scared. And by the end of it, it turns out both men are right. He's right. He was right to be afraid. And what the other character indicated about people are alike everywhere. Like, yeah, when you look at it, they are alike everywhere. Everywhere, whether it be within country to country or planet to planet. Xenophobia always will rule the day, and you're always afraid of the other. And that's what happens to him, regardless of the fact that they know that, he should be no threat. If you'll indulge me, I want to I'm going to sidetrack here and talk about the original story because it's interesting the differences between the two stories. I was able, like I had said before, I did track it down and read it. It's a blessedly short story, so it wasn't a big deal. It's more of, and quite frankly, I think a lot of the short stories that tend to be adapted for the Twilight Zone, especially since there are things that might have appeared in publications like, Fantastic Voyages and Amazing Story, those kind of publications, they didn't tend to be very lengthy. You're not usually not going to come up with like a 50-page story or something like that. It's usually going to be, 3, 5, 7, 10 pages. Maybe a little longer occasionally here and there, but usually around there. So the original story, Marcuson is actually the main character. Conrad is just an older fellow who's a wise friend of his. And he is the person who professes a theory, which is said in that story, people, wherever they are able to exist, are all the same. The Mars mission in the original story is a solo mission. Marcuson lands on Mars, and the Martians do not look like humans. They are still somewhat humanoid in basic shape, number of limbs, and so on, but they are clearly alien in appearance. Initially, there is no actual direct conversation between them, but the Martians are always talking amongst themselves in some sort of collection of, I would say, like sing-song tones. One might wonder if that concept found its way to Close Encounters of the Third Kind, quite frankly. They also exhibit a clear leeriness and mistrust of Marcuson as they continue to carry and brandish weapons at all times, even though he abandons his. It's also clear that no single Martian ever approaches too closely to him. They're always in pairs, if not more. After spending time at one of the Martian homes, where they become intensely interested in drawings he does of what an Earth home would look like and how it would be laid out, they go and quickly build him a cottage, resembling his drawings and anything he'd see on Earth. And the rest of the story, I like to do this, goes like this. I'm actually going to read from the actual transcript here. Because I really like what he does here. But Conrad was right, he thought warmly. They are people. Basically, they are no different from us. Marcuson moved into his new home that night, much to the delight of the Martians. He ate his dinner at a table which could have come from any Terran furniture store. He lay down in a bed any Terran would have been proud to own. The Martians did not dine with him. Instead, they stood by, conversing in their soothing musical language, happiness mirrored in every syllable. When darkness fell, they left him alone in his house. Marcuson filled the early evening hours studying the written Martian language. He'd made quite a little progress with the words and could now pick out phrases and whole sentences about the long, narrow books the two Martians had given him. It was about time he decided to widen his areas of research. Tomorrow he would insist upon visiting the gray city across the hills. But the people of the city came to visit him. He arose the next morning and found breakfast awaiting him. But as he sat down to the table, something caught his eye through the window. He arose and went outside. The Martians were there, hundreds of them, and more coming over the hills from the spired city. A chill such as he had never known swept through Marcuson. He saw the bars in which he was now imprisoned, the cage erected over his house, the sign in Martian lettering he'd interpreted into his own language and read with horror. Earth creature in its natural habitat. He saw the staring eyes of the Martians and realized the full, ghastly truth of Conrad's words. People are the same everywhere. He gripped the cage bars in his fists and screamed. And that's how that story ends.
I thought there were two interesting things about the interactions with him and the Martians in this, and I think it's in the short story as well. And that is, it happens a lot in the Twilight Zone, and Serling's an expert at it. And it's sort of a pattern I've only picked up on this rewatch, and that is, people literally tell you the truth, but it's these big gaps of omission and not of commission. Of where in this thing that they say no one will hurt you and we'll fix your ship. Now they don't say you're going to be able to take your ship home, and that we're not going to hurt you, but you're going to be imprisoned. You'll have everything you need Earthwise, but you're going to be alone and trapped. So there's almost the idea in a lot of these stories that it's a lesser intellect, playing chess with a greater intellect and feeling at ease without precise language, that leaves these big loopholes for the twist to come in the story.
Right. Right. Absolutely. Um, Now, for me, having read the entire original story, I would say for me, it was patently obvious that in this case, all of Sterling's changes really work so much better and make for a far more satisfying tale from start to finish. They do share very similar endings, as you saw from what I just read, but I think there is a bit more of a sudden pathos to the adaptation version. Um, and for me, even though, oh, just for the episode itself, even though there have been certainly a few more iconic endings towards Twilight Zone ending, be it Bemis's glasses shattering at the end of Time Enough at Last, or the unwrapping of the bandages at the end of Eye of the Beholder, or the true nature of that book, The Canamit's Lift, and To Serve Man. I actually think that this is one of the most famous, although perhaps misquoted, episode endings in the history of the series. I'll be honest, I feel if we were having this conversation, X number of years ago and I hadn't just rewatched it, I probably would have thought, oh, was that the one where they say it's a zoo at the end, just the way they say it's a cookbook at the end of To Serve Man? Maybe it's an ending that's probably been riffed on or parodied. Maybe, I don't know, maybe it was a Simpsons episode or something like that where they kept saying, we're in a zoo. I'm not really sure. But I think it's like we were saying before, it's a great and memorable ending, and it's a tragic one. And it's really one of the really big examples of a protagonist getting punished undeservedly. Um, it is funny that we've now gone through, including the one that's going to come after this. I guess we've gone through what, 25 episodes, 26 episodes, whatever it is of the first season right now. And I mean, I fancy myself a major Twilight Zone fan, can quote any number of episodes or whatever. But it's funny when I'm watching, especially as we know I'm keeping track of certain things, and just how many times someone ends up being stuck, stranded, or whatever, crash, whatever, on a planet or Mars or whatever. It's like, oh, and then something really bad happens to him. And in the ones that we've watched so far, and there's more to come, because I have specific episodes in mind. Oftentimes it's undeserved, and then every once in a while, oh, there's one jerk in the mix or something. I don't know if they don't land on, or they land on Earth and they think they're on another planet. So it just keeps happening. Or they come back to Earth and they should have been coming back in the first place. Basically, what Sterling keeps trying to tell us is, you know what, we just shouldn't, we shouldn't touch outer space. No, just kidding. But I personally have a great deal of affection for this episode because uh, I feel that it's really. I think I would never have said this is one of my all-time favorite episodes. I don't think it occurs to me that way. But I do think after now doing a rewatch of it, this is a grade A example. This is a prototypical Twilight Zone episode that gives you exactly the kind of, this is a Twilight Zone episode, you know, no holds barred, and it's gonna leave you with an ending where you're like, oh God, damn, that's a great ending, but no, that poor schmuck, it's, you know, I think it kind of deserves to be at least on that level. It's not Mount Rushmore level, might not be on the next tier, but it's there. It's definitely I think it's definitely falls into the category of definitely one of the better episodes.
Yeah, I think as far as protagonist goes, I was really surprised watching this, and it's probably informed by a life of seeing Roddy McDowall and what his career became. To sort of go back and see him not play a character named Roddy McDowall, the way that sort of even our greats like Al Pacino sort of became a version of Al Pacino late in life that he played and everything. Um, he really plays a compelling leading person that guides you on the emotional journey through this. And to sort of wrap up, I have a final question for you, because there's one thing this show didn't resolve for me, and I'm just curious what your thoughts are on it. What do you believe was going on with sort of the sadness of Tina? Was it that she knew what they were doing to him and felt bad about it? Was it that maybe she was a dissenting voice about what they were doing, or maybe she was a captive from somewhere else that, because he has sort of a kinship with her, and she's always looking sad throughout the episode. And I was just curious why you think they sort of had him connect with her and they focused on her quite a bit throughout the episode.
Okay. I believe this is not the first time they've done anything like this. It's certainly not the first, creature in a habitat they have on, on display for the populace here. Either that means it's been beings from other races and other planets, or just other forms of animal life on Mars itself, since obviously this is a very fantasy fictional world of Mars that can carry life, and you don't need, helmets or anything. My feeling was that she was a dissenting voice from the get-go, and perhaps even more so when you saw that it's kind of like the people are alike all over kind of thing. The fact that this is someone that if you didn't know any better, you'd think he was one of us. There's never an indication that they've done anything to change their form, because then they would be in a different form when they were looking at him when he was behind bars. So he looks like he could be one of them. So then you have a little bit of the mild attraction situation that's happening there, and which just makes it that much more sad. Like, it's not just, oh, I can never be with you. It's like, we're going to put you in a cage for the rest of your natural life. So, and I think she was just a character that, while the others just felt they were just so above him as far as, on the scale of whatever you want to call it. So they didn't view it any differently than putting a giraffe in an exhibit or something like that. She saw the true tragedy of what they were doing and had a hard time with it, and as we saw multiple times during the episode, even then running off at the end. So I think it's interesting only in the sense that it indicates that they do not all subscribe to a form of groupthink, that there is at least one. And if there's one, that means there possibly could be others that don't agree with what they're doing. And it makes it intriguing, like, oh, if there could be a sequel to this story and maybe we find out more about what would happen, and if build a series around it and whatever. And then next thing you know, oh my God, you know what we have? We have Planet of the Apes.
Well, yeah, I mean, I sort of thought, because she's named Tina, that it's almost like, the idealism of the youth that don't eat meat, that don't, you know what I mean? Like, sort of the idealism of youth that maybe even in their culture, there are people like, we don't need to cage these animals, quote unquote. And, but yeah, I thought this was, in my rewatch, I've found several episodes that in my younger days, I wouldn't have found as compelling, but I found this one pretty compelling on rewatch.
Yeah, as did I. So let me get to wrapping up here. I kind of made a decision earlier today and yesterday when I was putting together the notes for this podcast that I'm kind of going to move away from bothering mentioning the tone of the episode when I do my mini wrap up. Let's face it, I've decided that with the Twilight Zone, it's really about shades of light and dark. Some episodes are light, some are mid-range, and some are downright pitch black dark. The only difference is that within the episodes, some can start off fairly light and then turn quite dark by the end. Time Enough at Last might be an example of that. But I don't know if it's something that really needs to be cited beyond our general conversation and when I get to the tropes. So I've decided I will not be citing what I prescribe the tone to be from this point on. Unless I think I'll be covering the tropes anyway, which I will keep doing because I enjoy that part. The tropes. We've got astronauts. Hey, so many astronauts in this season. And we've got Martians. Well, we're going to get plenty of Martians on this series too. We get yet another crashed rocket ship. Can't wait to see how many of those there are by the time we've gone through all the Twilight Zone episodes. We've got science fiction. We've got aliens that speak the language. We have a tragic misunderstanding or just a lack of actual empathy, leading to the needlessly punished protagonist. We've got that living room, which, by the way, is straight out of Third from the Sun, that episode. That could almost be a trope in and of itself, too. The constant reuse of bits and pieces of props from also not just from other episodes, but from things like Forbidden Planet, which, whatever movie set was nearby, they totally went over like, oh, we're going to use that. I think they use parts of those things for both these episodes, quite frankly. So let's just get to rating the ending. I feel this is an all-time great ending, so I feel I got to give it at least a 9 for that ending. Rating the episode, I'll probably take it down just a degree from that and say an 8.5. Now, I will skip my little transition adaptation thing I've been doing for the last several podcasts, because I kind of want to discuss it a little bit later. So that way I feel there's no reason to further delay execution. See what I did there? Yeah.
I do.
Yes, you did. Execution was directed by David Auric McDermott. McDermott, born in Wilmette, Illinois, started out as an actor, working his way up from the stage to television at the near dawn of the medium back in 1949. He even met his wife Patricia when they were both working on the Hallmark Hall of Fame series in 1953. Now, I would love to say he got the inspiration to direct after he appeared on Alfred Hitchcock Presents in 1955, but I see that Hitch didn't direct that episode. Doesn't mean he didn't meet him, but I find it doubtful. But by the time we hit 1956 to 57, that's when McDermott had begun transitioning from acting into directing. His earlier efforts tended to be more gritty and serious, with episodes of series such as Peter Gunn and The Third Man. By the way, I would love to one day track down where one could find episodes of The Third Man as a series from the 1950s, because I love that film and I'm very intrigued to see what kind of TV show it was. Anyway, several years later, he ended up doing more comedies, such as Bewitched and Gilligan's Island, which is where he got reunited with Russell Johnson. He also directed 2 more Twilight Zone episodes, A Thing About Machines and Back There, both of which appear in season 2. The episode was written by Rod Serling, adapted from a short story by George Clayton Johnson. This is the second short story by Johnson that Serling has adapted into an episode this season, the first being The Four of Us Are Dying. The relationship that grew out of this led to Johnson writing for the series 5 episodes over the rest of its run, which included ones like Nothing in the Dark. That's an episode that many folks saw clips of earlier this year when Robert Redford passed away. He also wrote Kick the Can, which is one of the episodes that was later remade as one of the segments on the Twilight Zone, the movie. However, we did talk about Johnson quite a bit on STVD episode 435. That was the podcast that covered The Four of Us Are Dying. And we will have more to say about that original short story later on when Brian's discussing the meat and potatoes of this episode. But right now, I'm going to continue with the appetizers with a few slices of salami. No, I read that wrong. It's Salmi, Albert Salmi, who portrays the murderous lead in the episode. Born in Brooklyn, that's right, Brooklyn, New York, back in 1927, Salmi is yet another young man who got bit by the acting bug when he was in the service during World War II. After the war, he went to the Actors Studio and studied the craft of method acting with Lee Strasberg. He got great acclaim with his starring performance as Bo Decker in the play Bus Stop, but turned down the chance to reprise the role for the feature film adaptation, the one that co-starred one Marilyn Monroe. Because at the time he said he didn't like film work. Instead, the role went to Don Murray, who earned an Oscar nomination for the role. Of course, Salmi later did appear in a number of films. I don't know, perhaps it was youthful brashness on his part. He would go on to be a constantly working character actor, even if he always preferred the stage. He would work alongside luminaries of the time such as Paul Newman in an early version of Bang the Drum Slowly. He did a number of memorable roles on television, be it outlaws on westerns or scoundrels on shows like Lost in Space, which, by the way, is the thing I first recognized him from. As I said earlier, he did appear in films as well, but many more so later in life, where you can spot him in movies such as Brubaker, Dragon Slayer, even Caddyshack. Now, this is where the tone changes. His personal life. Well, is it saying something that his first marriage that lasted 7 years and the child from that marriage would later die at the too early age of 38 from heart disease? And that's not even remotely the darkest and most tragic relationship and final denouement in Salmi's life. No. He married again in 1964, a rather contentious relationship that yielded 2 daughters. He and his wife, Roberta, were separated. In February of 1990, Roberta had filed papers claiming that Salmi, an alcoholic, physically abused her, threatened her. It even led to her getting a restraining order as she was in fear for her life. Salmi denied those allegations, chalking them up to Roberta's emotional problems. Well, it appears her allegations were sadly accurate, for in late April of the same year, Salmi and his wife Roberta were found dead, and it was clear that he had shot her, then went upstairs and took his own life. So yes, another tragic bio tale for our Twilight Zone podcast.
Sounds like he really was a method actor.
Oh yeah, all the way to the end. Now I got to switch to the guy from Gilligan's Island. It's great. Next, we have Russell Johnson, who most recognized as the professor from Gilligan's Island. The eldest of 7 siblings, Johnson was born in Ashley, Pennsylvania back in 1924. Oh, here's a little fun note. Sadly and even strangely, he lost his father and one of his brothers, both to lobar pneumonia within a few weeks of each other. You thought it was all going to be light and airy there. Nope, hit you with one. Another man who served in World War II. Johnson flew 44 combat missions, and during one attack, he had to ditch his airplane and crash into the sea of Zamboanga. Have no idea if I pronounced that correctly. Now, obviously, he survived, although his co-pilot did not. He just broke both his ankles. So the Purple Heart was among the many medals and commendations he got for his time during the war. Now, he appeared in a number of genre and relatively low-budget films throughout the 1950s, such as Rancho Notorious, Law & Order, no, not that Law & Order, and Bad Man's Country. Now, the fun flicks and the things that I'm actually familiar with are from science fiction, such as This Island Earth, Attack of the Crab Monsters, and It Came from Outer Space. On TV, he appeared on Adventures of Superman as a gang leader, as well as episodes of Gunsmoke and The Outer Limits. He even starred in a series that lasted 2 whole seasons, Black Saddle, which I wonder if that's where they got the idea for Blazing Saddles. Nah. But yes, it's Gilligan's Island he's best known for. And even though he took on dozens and dozens of roles after he left the island, everything from Macmillan and Wife to Dallas to Alf and Roseanne, and so many more, that was always how he was going to be seen for the rest of his career. It didn't bother him per se. He was able to maintain a sense of humor about it and eventually even embraced it. He did pass away at the age of 89 in 2014. Let me see. In the crowd at the hanging party, we do have a few Twilight Zone semi-luminaries. George Mitchell is there. He appears. He's listed as Old Man. He actually shows up in 3 more Twilight Zone episodes, one that we've covered earlier this season. He's the cantankerous gas station guy in The Hitchhiker, and the one who doesn't give our ill-fated heroine any fucking help. And he'll appear in seasons 4 and 5 in the episodes Jess Bell and Ring-a-Ding Girl. Then there's John Lormer as the preacher, who I recognized, and probably a lot of other folks did, from his multiple appearances on, hey, there's that show again, Star Trek, among his astounding 177 listed credits, which of course include 3 more Twilight Zone episodes, Dust, The Last Rites of Jeff Myrtlebank, and, look, another person on Jess Bell. Was there anybody else in this episode? Well, you got the poor bartender. I hope he had insurance, but sadly back then there were no cameras to catch the wanton vandalism that took place in his bar. That actor is Richard Carlin, who also appears in another Twilight Zone episode, Season 3's The Mirror. And yes, I just realized I left out the murderous thug at the end of the episode. That little creep was portrayed by Than Wyan. His first name, Than. Didn't know that could be a first name. Anyway, maybe it was Nathan. They got rid of it. And he said, Nathan? Nah, just Than. Anyway, Wyan didn't appear in any additional Twilight Zone episodes, although he does show up in an episode of Sterling's later series, Night Gallery. Wyan actually had a pretty lengthy career, and you can spot him in any number of TV series like Get Smart, and then films like Being There and Splash. And he lived to a ripe old age of 95 when he passed away in 2015. Okay, that's enough for me. Now let's ease into the comforting tones of our Mr. Hewlett as Brian tells us far more about execution.
Opening monologue. Commonplace, if somewhat grim, unsocial event known as a necktie party. The guest of dishonor, a cowboy named Joe Caswell, just a moment away from a rope, a short dance several feet off the ground, and then the dark eternity of all evil men. Mr. Joe Caswell, who, when the good Lord passed out a conscience, a heart, a feeling for fellow men, must have been out for a beer and missed out. Mr. Joe Caswell, in the last quiet moment of a violent life. Now we move to the plot. In 1880, a cowboy named Joe Caswell is being hanged for murder, but he is suddenly transported to the future in 1960 as he falls towards his death. Caswell arrives in the laboratory of Professor Mannion. Mannion has used a time machine to pluck Caswell from the past as the world's first time traveler. Mannion notices the marks around Caswell's neck and is disturbed by his look and demeanor. Professor Mannion believes he must send Caswell back. As the pair argue over the meaning of justice and Caswell being hanged, Caswell admits to killing over 20 men. When told he will be returned to his time, Caswell kills Mannion with a desk lamp. He then runs into the busy street, but is quickly overwhelmed by the lights and the noise. He is startled by a public phone booth. He destroys a jukebox and shoots a television set at a local bar. He fires a gun at a car. He returns to the lab, begging the dead scientist to help him. As this is occurring, a thief enters the lab named Paul Johnson. In an ensuing fight, Johnson strangles Caswell with the cord from the window curtains. As Johnson tries to find Mannion's safe, he activates a time machine and is sent back to 1880. He is transported into the noose intended for Caswell. The bystanders at the necktie party are shocked to see a stranger dressed in different clothes in the place of Caswell. They question whether this was the devil, some other power, or whether they executed an innocent man. Closing. This is November 1880, the aftermath of a necktie party. The victim's name, Paul Johnson, a minor league criminal and the taker of another human life. No comment on his death save this: justice can span years. Retribution is not subject to a calendar. Tonight's case in point in the Twilight Zone. Now, I enjoyed this, Scott. I thought this was a interesting twist that the criminal faces another criminal, which is kind of unusual to sort of introduce a third or fourth element to a story. Usually in these short episodes, it's, a 2-element story or, 2-on-1. I thought that was an interesting addition to this story. And in doing some research, I was thinking about sort of the through line of these episodes. And there are a couple of through lines, I think. George Clayton Johnson wrote season 1, episode 1 of Star Trek. So we have a huge Star Trek thread running through both these episodes. But more importantly, I think this following on the heels of watching the other one, I probably wouldn't have connected it. But these episodes being back to back, you could almost name this is People Are the Same Whenever. That the criminals of basically a primitive criminal runs into a modern criminal, and it's the same thing, but the old justice is meted out to the new criminal. I thought some highlights of this were the idea of what would occur if you were suddenly thrust 80 years into the future, how unnerving that would be. I think this is the second instance we've had somebody thrown off by a phone booth. And you can imagine, now probably if I put my kid in a phone booth, he would be disturbed because he'd be like, what's this? How do I get out? What's going on? But the idea that the technology was so frightening that it overwhelmed his senses. And I thought there was a great line in it that conveyed a lot, and that is, he said, it's so loud that the world was so loud that the ambient noise of being in a busy city would be overwhelming to someone who was accustomed to living in big, broad, open spaces. And I believe it's mentioned in the episode he was I think he was from Wyoming. That he was a Wyoming cattle boss. So, the question of what is justice seemingly, arguably universal in the view of Serling. And again, to tie a thread of what you were talking about, reused sets, we see the set of the city, some of the lights and the storefronts as he's going through town. But in a very effective, short way, shows him being overwhelmed and returning back, wanting to go back, that it was so overwhelming, he'd go back and accept his fate. And then you have the inherent irony of the Twilight Zone that ultimately he's strangled with a cord around his neck, which then is the same punishment meted out to Johnson. The final thing before I'll throw it to you is I did find one quote that George Clayton Johnson wrote about Serling's adaptation. And the quote was, "Rod took my idea and went off to the races with it. He had a remarkable knowledge of what would and wouldn't work on television. He took everything that wouldn't work out of execution. He worked like a surgeon, a little snip here, a complete amputation over there, move this bone into place, graft over that one. When he was done, my little story had grown into a television script that lived and breathed on its own." So he gave high marks to Rod Serling, and as you mentioned earlier, I think went on to work with him quite a bit and probably cut his chops to allow him to go on and write on Star Trek and do things later in life. So those are my thoughts, and I'll throw it to you.
Okay, well, as we mentioned, and you were just talking about the original story by Johnson, and we were discussing it before we started recording tonight. So while I didn't read the story in any form in its entirety, I did read an article about it, which really covered all the fine points of it. Not the first time I referred to these folks' blogs, so I'll be fair and give them a shout out. So it's not like I just came up with it on my own. It's a website, a blog that some guy put together called Shadow and Substance, which explores the works of Rod Serling. Really nicely put together. This guy Paul has put them together. So came across what the differences were. I mean, the setup is the same with the hanging party. By the way, I always find it interesting. I mean, I know they use the phrase necktie party, and that's cute. But I also like the fact that there isn't they do establish there's a judge there. So that by doing that, we have established this isn't a lynch mob situation, that justice is going to be served, that the decision has been made. Now, you're actually a lawyer and you have probably have a good idea about the history of law, whatever. I don't know if this is a situation in 1880 where, there would have been a jury being used at this point, or if that would have been employed, or they would have simply skipped that and just gotten to it, or something that was clearly this man killed, so many people, and they know that for a fact, and he clearly did. Let's just get to it. Let's save the territory some money, from a trial or what have you. The differences in the story seem to come about more when he rockets to the future, travels to. I use rocket just as a verb, not as an actual rocket, obviously. For example, when the character, and their names are different too, but I find differences like that to be negligible. So that's why I'm not bothering to mention the different names of all the characters. Who cares? He bolts out of the lab without having killed the scientist who brought him back. And the scientist himself actually has an assistant as well. So there's two of them that are there. He obviously he is bothered by the world around him, the environment, the sounds, the horns, the lights, and everything. But instead of wrecking a bar, he ends up in a park and next to a very friendly, and you could say it's the hooker with a heart of gold, apparently, who is somewhat understanding, trying to figure out what he's talking about, because how can one believe someone just, traveled 80 years or whatever it is in the original story. But then he spots the scientist and assistant chasing after him. So he goes on the run again and he gets hit by a car and he's being taken into an ambulance, and the scientist and assistant are trying to convince him that he should be put into their care. He's still mobile, but all he keeps thinking is that they're going to send him back, which is the plan. They do want to send him back. So he escapes again, ends up in, I think, a sporting goods store. Not really sure, because that might be where he gets a hold of a weapon. But he's actually shot to death by policeman. And upon the point of his death, he disappears and then reappears in the hangman's noose in 1880. I'm not sure if the year is the same in the original story. Like I said, I didn't read the entire story. Not that there's any explanation why when he dies, he would end up flipping back in time. That's not usually how that works, but whatever the rules are for that story, I don't know if Johnson ever established it. So I just knowing those details, much like, even more so than with People Are Like All Over, although it's similar, certainly again shows his flair for, just for grand irony, and really kind of stories coming full circle and thus giving us a bit more of a kick at the end. So, and it also, I think, establishes the main character as a bit more of a rotten person from what I'm gathering in the original story compared to what we see in the Twilight Zone episode. The real great thing about these episodes that we've been watching, and why I think the Twilight Zone is so one of the many reasons the Twilight Zone is so highly regarded, is the amazing amount of just beautiful artistry and finesse of telling a story from beginning to end, and making the specific character or characters that you need, that are required for the story, pop just enough. And you're accomplishing all this, at least for 4 of the 5 seasons, in only 20 something minutes. That, you just don't see that. And you have to keep recreating them from episode to episode. We're not getting successive episodes to linear, to get that kind of serialized storytelling. They accomplish it all in one episode. And more often than not, those main characters, or even sometimes side characters, remain so distinct that we remember them 65 years later. And that's remarkable. It's remarkable. And just think of the fact that there are a number of other anthology shows around this time, which are actually very good. Like Alfred Hitchcock Presents is a fantastic show, a fantastic series, which actually has more episodes than The Twilight Zone. But those people like myself who are fans, we might remember a few specific episodes, like the woman who murders her husband with a frozen leg of lamb and then feeds it to the police, and a few, or the one with Joseph Cotton where he can't move and he's almost paralyzed and he's hoping someone and he's a horrible person, and the thing that actually saves him is like the teardrop or something like that. But when you consider just how many episodes there were of that series, which means it was very successful at the time, and Twilight Zone, and yes, obviously it's because the Twilight Zone has been reshown day after day, year after year, marathons, whatever. But there's a reason for that. There's a reason for a show like that, or The Honeymooners, or I Love Lucy, to keep being shown over and Twilight Zone perhaps even more so than any of them. Everybody knows about Twilight Zone marathon on New Year's Eve. That's been going on for decades now. But it's just the way the series lives and breathes for such a long period of time. And the fact that, if I was to sit here, I could probably come up with not just 5 or 10, I come up with 20, 30 iconic individual characters from different episodes of Twilight Zone, which all kind of, you could just put them together in a patchwork and imagine them in your mind, not to mention Rod Serling himself. So it's interesting when you have 2 episodes that we've talked about tonight and are continuing to talk about. And while neither of these, is in the pantheon of, the most iconic of iconic, none of them are Eye of the Beholder or Time Enough at Last or It's a Good Life, which are, or even The Monsters Are Due on Maple Street. they're still two really stark examples of what the Twilight Zone was and what it could be. And these are very different episodes. And then even when you look at the ones from the last time we spoke, and that's what makes each one kind of a separate little jewel on its own. And it, whether you feel bad for the character at the end, or you feel that justice has been served, as the scientist character says in this episode, or something along those lines, whatever. You rarely, if ever, I'm not going to say every episode's perfect or even near perfect. There will be a couple near duds that we'll get to eventually from what people say. I might not agree with those people. I don't know. You almost always have a feeling of satisfaction after a Twilight. Almost every episode is a satisfying meal unto itself.
I think
And,
that. Oh,
you
I'm
know,
sorry.
yeah, and they all taste different.
Well, yeah, I think what I've realized watching the show is if you have a choice where you could have a competent writer and an excellent actor, or you can have an excellent writer and a competent actor, you should choose the one with the excellent writer, because you look at the broad range of performers used throughout these episodes, and I'm not saying like they're not excellent actors, but I'm saying like you're finding people who at that time were a bargain to get because they weren't stars, but the writing elevates everything. And, it helps you to perform if you have great things on the page to say and a great story to act within. And I think that's why so many creatives and writers cite this show as an influence that actors who go on to have really good careers, and mostly as really big character actors with a few leading actor exceptions, the writing stands out, and rewatching it really brings that home in an episode like this and the previous episode. And the final thought I had before I let you close out is I want to ask you this question. Did you notice, and I thought this was the way that I think Serling was able to just nicely sort of implant social commentary in this episode. What was the only thing that Caswell recognized in the future and knew? A gun.
Oh, okay.
He sees a revolver. He knows what that is. He knows how to use it, and he goes out and fortunately doesn't use it to kill anyone, but fires at cars, shoots the television out in the bar. But I thought that's an interesting little tidbit to say that the savages of today are no different than the savages of the past, that the gun is still their tool.
Nice catch. I like that. I wonder if they were making a little Elvis reference with that, or wait, Elvis didn't start shooting TVs till years later. There was a little thing. It's not a big thing, but kind of stuck in my head a little bit, but towards the end of the episode. And initially, I was wondering, oh, was that an idea that they might have been able to use just for one additional little kicker or not? But I talked about it a little with you the other day. And the first thing I'm going to refer to is specifically that the character at the end, you said his name was Paul Johnson, I think it was.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just referred to him as the creepy thug guy at the end. He pockets the Zippo lighter, which was interesting because they made a big point of referencing the lighter during the episode. Even Coswell's reaction to it, like fire out of thin air, or whatever. And I mentioned to you, you talked about lighters existing in the 90s. Well, I did my history. I did my research because this reminds me of when I was writing a script that took place in the Old West. I had to keep up looking up things to see if they existed or when it did or what. So that if that lighter was in the guy's pocket, if they had decided to do a thing where the lighter had fallen out. Now, while in the 1820s in Germany, they had developed something that was essentially a lighter, The idea of actually having a portable lighter that people had on them was not a thing. The Ronson, I mean, they didn't start with Ronson didn't start like one of the first portable lighters until 1910. The Zippo itself didn't even come into being until the 1930s. So it might have caused a little bit of a, oh, what's this? Maybe they wouldn't have gone too crazy with it, and that's why he didn't bother, because it's 1960, and in 1960 there wasn't really much in the way of, handheld electronics or technology that would weird someone out in 1880. They would more likely be weirded out by, a car or something like that. But we didn't have I don't think they didn't have digital watches yet or something like that. That could have been a smaller thing. They certainly didn't have all the other kinds of tech. And a transistor radio wouldn't have made any sense because it wouldn't have done anything, because it wouldn't have picked up anything. So it just would have been like, I don't know what this is. It's not like picking up a phaser from like a Star Trek episode.
Right.
However, there is something else that bothered. I went back to check that out, and then I noticed something else which actually bothered me just a little bit more. In that final scene, after he's killed Coswell and he's walking around the lab and he's flipping on the things, whatever. But almost the entire time, he's carrying the set of keys that he grabs from the desk, to the point that when he goes into the time machine and the lights go on, the door closes on him, and he raises his arms, in protest and screaming. The keys are still in his hands as he disappears, which means the keys should still be in his hands when he reappears in the news, which means those keys should have fallen. He should appear, and then the keys should fall to the ground. And it's a bunch of keys. It's not a key. You're not going to miss that. But it wasn't. There was nothing. It wasn't there. That felt like a little bit of a mistake. And I kept thinking, oh, maybe he's gonna. No, he doesn't drop the keys in a time machine. They're in his hands as he disappears. So it's a minor thing, very tiny. It's one of those little gaffer mistakes, like someone with continuity, someone had caught that, whatever. Someone didn't catch it, whatever. So it's funny because me and you had a conversation. There was something else I thought was a mistake, and then I realized, like, oh no, I'm wrong. I made a mistake. They're correct. But then I noticed, I was like, they did screw up something after all. So shame on you, Mr. Sterling. No, just kidding.
So you went back and found a mistake. So guess what, Twilight Zone? The ball's back in your court.
That's right. You're no Breaking Bad. Speaking of that time machine, as I said earlier in the podcast, I didn't mention the transition. I didn't do the transition element I've done in a lot of these podcasts, where I take the words of Rod Serling that he does that you can't find on some versions of the episode. Like what I'm watching, I'm not getting those, but I think if I put on my DVDs, they do have them. It depends which cut you're watching on which streaming service, perhaps. I usually just I tinker with them just a little bit to be a smartass before we transition to the next episode. But I didn't want to do it with this one. But I thought it was worth noting because it's one of the few where it's a bit more elaborate than usual, and it's done kind of comedically. I call it Serling's comedic tag. And the dialogue kind of goes like this, and it has him actually, standing in the time machine, whatever. And Rod Serling, he says, "This may look like some kind of kooky greenhouse. Actually, it happens to be a conveyance, a mode of travel, time travel. And next week, you'll see Albert Salome take an extended journey from 1880 to 1960. I hope then, next week, you'll be able to take another walk with us into the Twilight Zone." And here's where Serling disappears, but we still hear his voice, and he's going, "Hey, where'd everybody go?" So I was like, okay, it's a little bit, especially in an episode which is, when you get to the end, it's not a very funny episode, but it's certainly.
Do you think that is a choice to sort of give a little levity, to sort of give a palate cleanser to the end of the previous episode?
Oh, people are like all over. Perhaps. I don't. I like to think Serling would prefer people just keeping roasting on a spit of misery and despair, quite frankly. All right, so I know we're running a bit longer than normal, so let me get to the Twilight Zone tropes. Of course, we have time travel. And of course, we have the Old West. And we have, it's in the very title, execution, which means that's a Twilight Zone trope. because people are condemned to die all the time on the Twilight Zone, be it a hangman's noose or strapped to an electric chair, or you name it. We have a scientist, but not necessarily a mad one, but perhaps well-meaning and misguided. We have death. Death arising in multiple times throughout this episode. By the way, we had death in the other one too. Someone died. Anyway, now, for a second there, I thought we were almost going to get a death of someone falling out or through a window again, which happens so much on the Twilight Zone. But he only smashes through the window, but doesn't. But then he gets the more ironic hanging by the Venetian blind cord. Now, I almost want to think that at this point, maybe I should the neon signs and the hustle and bustle and floating around, since we actually got that in The Four of Us Are Dying, which coincidentally was also based on a George Clayton Johnson story. Maybe I'll toss that into the mix as another trope. By the way, I forgot a couple until we were talking about the episode that were in the episode. Hey, look, a phone booth playing another little significant part. There you go. They love phone booths. Why didn't they have Superman ever appear on the show? Did I mention a bar? You have to have a bar somewhere and some crap happening there. It happens in this episode too. And of course, let's not overlook justice, and eventually the idea of justice being dispensed, and as I mentioned earlier, the comeuppance for evil deeds, which is the opposite of the previous Twilight Zone episode for sure. See, I can't get rid of tropes. Tropes are fun. Tone, screw that. Grade for the ending. I am a big fan of this ending. I think it's a neat little twist there, and I will give that neat little ending a neat little 8.5. It's a big grade for the ending. However, for the episode, I will lower the grade. I can't go that far with it. I think it's definitely a solid episode. Not spectacular though. Maybe it's because I didn't have a rooting interest. Nah, I don't play those games. But I will give the episode a 7.5 for the overall episode. So, as we bow our heads, only briefly, for what amounts to the execution of two dastardly souls, we can now raise them up for one of the better ones. Brian, thank you for joining us tonight.
Thank you, Scott. Really enjoyed the conversation and discussing these episodes.
As did I. And as for you, the listener, we will return, I'd like to say in a couple weeks. Let's just say a few weeks to be on the safe side. We will return with our views and analysis of two more Twilight Zone episodes. A historically significant episode, even if you might not remember it, titled The Big Tall Wish, and a somewhat less weighty affair known as A Nice Place to Visit. These are the 27th and 28th episodes from the first season of Twilight Zone. And as they are not among the more widely viewed and iconic episodes, I would certainly recommend tracking them down on Paramount Plus or Amazon or wherever you choose to watch the series, and then come back to listen to our little operation here. I do hope you all will join us then. Thank you, and good night.
Good night.